Hey everyone, Professor August here, and today I will be discussing Omar El Akkad's 2025 publication, One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. So let's get into it. So this book is going on my syllabi for all of my courses. My students will have to read it and they will have to respond to this book. I think it's a must read for everybody, especially if you're in like the center of politics, a centrist or political left, you're center left or you're Democrat or you're progressive or social democrat, whatever you call yourself. If you're a progressive or, you're not part of the conservative part of politics, then this book is really meant for you because this book, we don't often get books from the left that criticize the left. And this is one of those books that does that in a way that, as a lefty, it just fed my soul. For 10 years now, I have just wanted to express ideas that I couldn't because I didn't have the framework for it, nor did I have the vocabulary for it. I just didn't know how to put it into words. The feelings and thoughts that I was having, I just couldn't find a concise way of saying it. And that's what this book does. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes. I don't know who the audience was for this when he wrote it. I imagine it wasn't the conservative part of the country because I don't think they would pick up a book like this. I don't think it was, the super left part of this country because I think a lot of them already align with this way of thinking. It reads as targeting the center of the political spectrum and the left, so like Democrats. Um, and the ideas that are explained in this book, I think, are so concise and have fed my soul in a way that my soul has not been fed in a very long time by a book. So I'm going to talk about this. I'm not going to talk about it in terms of my political ideology or my individual opinions because those are mine, and perhaps I'll make a video sometime later about those things. But in terms of the arguments that Omar Al Akkad is making in this book, I think they're valid opinions and perspectives, and they give a framework to those of us who haven't been able to verbalize the ideas that we want so badly to articulate without being labeled things that we don't want to be labeled, and without um, fear of other people's opinions on social media. So let's talk about the book. The book is a nonfiction book, so it's not a novel. He's written novels before. His most famous one, I think, is called American War. I'll have a separate video about that in the future. But this one, it's nonfiction. It's part memoir about Omar Al Akkad's childhood, or there are like snippets of it when he was a child in Qatar. There are snippets of his life as a journalist, as an adult. There's a little bit of family history in there. The book is about Palestine without being about Palestine. It is a book about colonialism. It is a book about Western imperialism. But all of this is weaved together. So he'll lay out a little snippet of what's happened in Palestine in the last few years, and then he'll have a little snippet about his childhood and something about his adult life as a journalist, and then an overarching criticism of Western political liberalism. And the way that he frames it is Western political liberalism in comparison to conservatism is very polite and very proper. And there are certain things that we don't talk about as a liberal. There are certain topics that we don't bring up in companies or like in public settings because they may be considered distasteful or uncomfortable. And we have a very nice, florid way of talking about certain things just to keep a civilized society. And that's part of the problem that he identifies with Western, especially American political liberalism. And I think that's really important because in the last decade or so, I've noticed, and I'm sure everybody else has noticed, that we have, as a society, started to more and more talk about certain issues without actually naming those issues. So, for example, we won't call a genocide when we know what genocide means and see genocide happening. We'll just call it killings, we'll call it a war, we'll call it a conflict, but we won't call it the thing that it actually is. We won't call a terrorist event as a terrorist event. We'll call it an act of resistance, or we'll call it something that it isn't, only because the media in this country and in the West has tied sort of this kind of liberalism of politeness, this politeness, I don't know, a polite civilized society. It has dictated the way that we talk about certain issues. And if you use a certain word or if you use a certain phrasing, then you might be labeled as a radical thinker. You might get in trouble for, I don't know, political opinion that you hold, or you might get in trouble for, um, a type of phrase that you use. You might lose your livelihood. You might lose access to political power. You might lose access to money. And so we have then started to shrink the way that we talk about certain things, uh, or just obfuscate it, just sort of bury it in florid language. And that's one of the issues that Omar El Akkad has with the political left in this country. When you see something that is immoral, when you see something that is problematic, by changing the way that you talk about it in order not to get into trouble, you are changing the core of who you are as a human being. And you are then allowing the system to change you, your humanity. And that's his argument. Instead of you acting in order to change the system, you are allowing the system to change you. And this is just a concept that I've had for a long time in my head, bouncing around, and I couldn't quite put it out because I didn't know how to. And then he did it so simply. He doesn't talk about this in this book, but I think the way that I understand it is this thing called the Overton window. The Overton window is this political idea that if society is just on a spectrum and you have very conservative on one side and very, very liberal on one side, what society considers acceptable is right in the middle. But political centrists, which most people claim to be, I'm an independent, I'm a political centrist, I don't like extremes, fine. If you're a political centrist, what ends up happening is that Overton window over time shifts to one of the radical extremes. And because of centrism, what we end up doing as a society is allowing for more radical ideas to become normalized because we don't want to cause trouble. We don't want to rock the ship. We don't want to ruin anybody's day. And so instead of taking a firm moral stance on an issue, we'll just call an issue complicated and say, isn't it so tragic? It's so complicated. I hope for better days. As a political centrist, you then are allowing that Overton window to shift to include something that is so radical, but over time becomes normalized. So I'll give you an example that is not in the book, but go with me here. So the sky is blue, but you have, and most people in the United States would argue the sky is blue. That's what is acceptable in the middle of that Overton window. But there's somebody over here on the political spectrum who says the sky is green. And everybody in the middle says, no, that's not right. The sky isn't green. But then that person who says the sky is green keeps saying the sky is green, the sky is green. And because as the political spectrum in the middle says, I don't want to deal with this, I don't want to cause drama, eventually we just sort of say, okay, maybe sometimes the sky is green because of the way the sun is setting or because of, cloud coverage or whatever. And then eventually that Overton window shifts to include that idiotic idea as being part of the normalized social understanding of what color the sky is. And so in this book, what he does is with politics, with Palestine, for example, the way that we talk about Palestine, the way that we talk about the Iraq War, the way that we talk about indigenous people in the United States, the way that we talk about African slavery in the United States, the way that we talk about colonialism in the United States. Over time, centrism and that are a person's inability to call a thing what it is because of fear that it's going to cause drama, they allow those radical ideas to become normalized within the discourse so that we can just turn a blind eye and not think about them. So that's one of the arguments that he makes is we have to be precise in the way that we talk about things. We have to not fear language because language is meant to be precise for us to be able to describe a thing as it is. If we are unable to describe a thing as it is, our morals start to fail because if you start seeing now the sky idea was just a simple one, but if you see a genocide happening, for example, and you can't call it a genocide because you don't want to offend a certain group of people, or if you don't want to offend the political infrastructure or a class of people or a political ideology or whatever it is, By not calling it what it is, then you are giving up a little bit of your moral clarity because you simply don't want to rock that boat. So that's one of the arguments he makes. Another argument that I found really interesting is this issue of moral clarity after the fact. So this goes back to the title of the book. One day, everyone will have always been against this. And in the United States, a really interesting thing that he brings up is during the time of slavery, there were a lot of people who were against slavery, but just kind of let it happen. During the time of the Holocaust, a lot of people were, against the Holocaust and just let it happen. During, uh, I don't know, Jim Crow, there were a lot of people who were against it, to sort of let it happen. Um, at the very start of colonization in this country, when Europeans settled and started eradicating the indigenous population, some people were against it, but they sort of let it happen. And while it's happening in the mix, you kind of think, all right, well, this is a terrible thing. What's the alternative? And what he points out is that sort of thinking, that black and white binary thinking of the world is either you with your boot and on somebody else's neck, or somebody else with their boot on your neck. And if that's the way you see the world, it is a sad world that you live in, because you cannot then think of a better environment or better world for everybody to live in, because it's always kill or be killed. And so if we think about the indigenous population in the United States, we eradicated them. That's historical fact. They are a very small percentage of the population now, and we have reaped their entire, all of the resources that were once part of this continent. They now belong to the United States. Well, hundreds of years later, now when I'm at work or I'm at an event, a public event, there will be a land acknowledgement that says, we recognize that we are on the unceded land of such and such a tribe. And a land acknowledgement doesn't really do anything other than to say, yeah, we were really, really bad before, and we now recognize how bad we were. Sorry. But now let's talk about this, book, or let's talk about this movie, or let's talk about this, famous person. It doesn't solve anything. All it's done is given us this like moral fuzzy feeling that we recognize how terrible it was, and we recognize that we did a lot of bad stuff before, but aren't I so clever and moral now that I recognize it? Well, okay, the same thing you can do with slavery. You'd be hard pressed. I mean, well, maybe not these days, but when I was a kid, you would have been hard pressed to find somebody who was pro slavery. And so you would talk about slavery in the United States, and it would be, just this horrible thing that this country did. This country was founded on slavery, on the backs of black people brought from Africa, and it was just horrid. And what do we do now? We say, well, it's over now, and we recognize that it happened, and let's move forward. Peace and prosperity and equality for all. Okay, that doesn't solve anything, but also this tendency for us to constantly do that is where we are now as a world and as a society. So we see the same thing happening with Palestinians. And what Omar El Akkad points out is the Palestinians are being harmed. And if we cannot say what is happening to them, it is because of some, I don't know, moral failing, but also because a person may not want to say something because they might lose their job. A person might not want to say something because they'll lose their friends. A person may not want to say something because they'll lose their political standing. Whatever it is, there may be a reason why a person wouldn't want to say what's happening to the Palestinians. But going back to the title, one day everyone will have been against this, because as time progresses and as political winds change and as people's ideas change, society inevitably ends up in a position where we can then look back at a horrible, horrific event and say, oh, how terrible that that thing happens or happened. And let's now recognize that terrible thing and say some nice, florid, flowery words, because it literally has no impact on my life whatsoever. The indigenous dispossession of North America, hundreds of years ago has literally no bearing on me whatsoever right now. Me living in the Bay Area, like historically, I can say this land did not belong to the United States. It is now firmly in the grasp of the United States. It is part of the state of California. I have a house here. I understand what's happened. Um, but it's not like that thing that happened hundreds of years ago has no bearing on me right now. And that's kind of the point that he's making, is to say, yes, the Palestinian cause is trying to articulate to the world that they are suffering, and without the world recognizing it, that is a moral failing. But at some point, we'll look at that, and we'll look at the last few years and say, oh yeah, that was terrible. I've always been against it. I've always been against the destruction of human lives, and I've always been against the dispossession of people, and the destruction of culture and language and religion and murder. I've always been against it. Right? So that's kind of the historical equivalency that he's giving us, as we look at the indigenous population of the United States, we look at slavery in the United States, we look at the Holocaust, and we can say that we were against those things. But there are parallels that are happening across the globe right now, not just in Palestine, but in other parts of the world. And without the ability to say those things, for fear of our livelihoods, uh, we lose ourselves, we lose our morality, we lose our humanity. But eventually, society will become just like it is right now with those historical events, to say, oh, yeah, we were always against it. How terrible that it actually happened. So I think that's a really interesting point that he brings up, to say, deal with your morality as a human being, be precise in the language you use, understand what's happening. Also, you, especially if you're a left person, so like Democrat, social democrat, progressive, whatever you label yourself, uh, you have to understand the morality of the time in which you're living, and you have to be comfortable with attacking power, especially if it's power that you think is supposed to be representative of you as a human being. So if you are upset with a political figure that more or less aligns with you, but on specific moral issues they have huge failings, it is okay for you to constantly barrage that political figure or group of political figures with questions, demanding answers, demanding change. And one of the last issues that I'll bring up, which I thought was fascinating, I'm rambling at this point, but it is a very good point that he brings up, is there will be people who read this book that disagree with his political opinion or his framing of this particular issue and history and what's happening with the Palestinians. But for him, it doesn't really matter what the criticism is, because he has his moral center. He understands what's happening and he's saying it. The people that are critical of this book are going to be people who benefit from colonialist endeavors. So these are people who want to keep the status quo because there is either some political advantage or some social advantage, some economic advantage to not change the dynamics. And so if there is a change in any of those dynamics, it then affects an individual. And so that sort of colonial model of um, the economy or society, politics, whatever it is, has to stay the same. And so his one of his arguments is, if you are, actually, he doesn't say this explicitly, but I'm reading into it this one thing. If you read this book and you have issues with it, it would be important to be a little reflective, and think about why these arguments aren't sitting well with you. Because the idea of a person being murdered morally should just be reprehensible to everybody. The idea of a person being dispossessed of their land should be morally reprehensible to everybody. The idea of somebody losing their language or their culture or their family history or their entire family tree, those things should be morally reprehensible to us as humans, regardless of our politics. If any of those arguments that he makes are problematic for you, you then have to think about why those things are problematic for you. And the answer he gives is that you're most likely a beneficiary of the colonial system. And if you are a beneficiary of the colonial system, then you might instinctively dislike the argument that he makes. Now, I'm saying that sitting in my house in the Bay Area with a nice job and, have a very comfortable, happy existence. Uh, do I understand that I am a beneficiary of all things colonial that the United States has done? Absolutely. Um, do I also understand how problematic that history is? Yes. It is literally my job. I teach it on campus. Like, that's what my job is. But I also now have a framework to be able to talk about the changes that I want to see in my politics, in my local politics, in my state politics, and in the national politics. Am I single handedly going to be able to change the federal system to make things better at the federal level? No, I'm never going to run for political office at that level. I'm never going to run for politics because I can't stand, being on stage. That's just the honest truth of it. This, me, YouTube, filming a video, this isn't the political stage. So like I'm never going to be one of those people who's going to run for office and like become president. I know that. But I can do stuff in my day-to-day life to make my surroundings better. I can work in politics around me. In fact, I do. I can work on campus to make things better for myself and my colleagues and my students. And so I will. And so, you know, I'm never going to be able to produce a book like this because I don't have the intellect for it. I understand that. He did it, and that's his contribution to our segment of the political spectrum. I will have smaller things that I can do. And some of the people who are watching this, some of my students are going to have bigger stages and bigger microphones and be able to do things that I will never be able to do. The point is, though, that I don't stop. And the point is that he doesn't stop. And the point is that if you have a moral, clear center of understanding of what the world is and what humanity is, you ought not stop either. You ought to continue and try to make things better for us and for everybody else. Do I think this is a good book? Yes, of course I do. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, it's going on my syllabi. Everybody's going to have to read it. Again, if you haven't read it, there's a link in the description to the publisher. Buy a copy for yourself, buy multiple copies, give it to your friends, give it to your relatives. It is worth reading because it isn't just about this particular moment in history. You can read this, in the year 2050 and it'll still have relevance because people will always people. People will always be people. And there will always be political systems that you oppose, and there will always be people whose ideas you oppose. And if this book had been written 30 years ago, it would have hit the same way because it just has ideas and a framework to think about the world that I think is really, really important. Okay, I've rambled on way too long about this book. It is good. Go get a copy, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Bye. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe below. Catch you in the next video.